All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Medina, Learning Services Manager at San Diego Grantmakers. And we'll give folks just a few minutes to join us and catch up, and then we'll get started momentarily. Thank you. Actually, I do see that it's 11:47, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know we have a bit of a truncated presentation, but I can assure you the content's going to be very valuable. So I'm going to suggest we just dive right in. And let me just give everyone a heads up. Oops. My apologies. I just need to one modification. Oop. My sincerest apologies all. I realized that my PowerPoint was in the very end and we got to go back to the beginning. All right, that's what we're looking for. So thank you again. My name is Carlos Medina, Learning Services Manager at San Diego Grantmakers, and I'm excited to welcome you to our breakout session on shaping the future of affordable housing and homelessness in California. Now, just to go over a few brief housekeeping components. On the right, you'll see a column where it says questions. Please feel free to include any questions that you may have in the presentation there, and we will do our best to get to those during the presentation. And then also know that, friendly reminder, our conversations today are focused on policy, not politics. And so we ask you please frame your questions and your perspectives in a way that is respectful to all participants. And at this time, it is my honor to introduce our three speakers today. And starting with, Andrea Alulian, who manages the Conrad and Hilton Foundation's domestic grant making in the area of chronic homelessness. Additionally, we have joining us Elizabeth Kneebone, who provides strategic leadership in designing and managing and implementing the research portfolio and agenda at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. As well as joining us will be Jasmine Segura, who contributes over 12 years of experience in migrants' rights organizing and social justice movements. And she's joining us from the Common Council Foundation. So I'd like to thank them for being here. I'd like to thank you for being here. And we'll start this morning with Elizabeth, who will provide an overview of affordable housing and homelessness in California. And then Andrea and Jasmine will review the current policy landscape and future-focused opportunities with chances for discussion throughout. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started. And I would like to hand it over to Elizabeth Kneebone.
Thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate the chance to be part of this really important conversation today. As Carlos mentioned, I want to start by helping give some framing and context to the conversation by looking at the roots of the housing and homelessness crisis in California and recent trends and scale of the need, which we know is only going to become more acute now that we're facing this COVID-19 crisis. So if we go to the first slide, which can help us sort of see nationally how California stacks up and really helps, I think, underscore that the roots of the challenges we're seeing today go back decades. For years, we've seen a lot of economic growth in the state. That's the size of the circles, especially in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, as wage growth and jobs have increased across the state. At the same time, we've seen some of the biggest pullbacks in production. So even as we're seeing this economic prosperity and growth, we're not building enough to keep pace with demand. That's where you see the dark red circles up and down the state as production has fallen off relative to previous decades. Next slide, please. And it's not just that we're not building enough, it's also the type of housing that tends to get built across the state. So when you look at cities that actually have seen some growth in housing supply in recent years, it's largely single-family homes. And that matters because single-family homes, and particularly the larger format types of single-family homes that have been the trend in production over the years, tend to be more expensive. They're often priced in the top third of regional home prices. So that just means that more and more we've seen home ownership increasingly out of reach for more and more households. As of 2018, in the San Jose sort of Silicon Valley area, the typical price of an entry-level home, so a home price in the bottom third of the market, a typical price was over $760,000. In the Bay Area, an entry-level home was going for more than $500,000. In LA, it was approaching $500,000, $435,000 for an entry-level home. So we've seen increasingly that homeownership is harder to access for more and more households. And the next slide shows that the implications of that mean more pressure on the rental market. One of the fastest growing segment of the rental market in recent years are households making over $100,000. So we've seen more and more demand on the rental stock from higher income households. And the next slide shows that as a result, we've seen tremendous upward pressure on rents in recent years. So you can think about this as supply, the challenge is sort of twofold. We're not building enough, and we're also losing stock that was affordable to lower and more moderate income households in the past because of this mismatch between demand and supply. The next slide shows how this plays out across the state. That now the average asking rent for a 2-bedroom in the state, across the state, well outstrips what the typical renter's income could afford without a housing cost burden. And that's the typical renter. Imagine the impacts, and it's quite clear, you can see on this graph, that light blue is the impact on extremely low income households that are seeing just rents increasingly out of reach. And the next slide gives us a bit more information about the extremely low income population in California, which is particularly important because these households are the most vulnerable and at risk of homelessness because of these economic challenges that they're facing. We have almost 166,000 extremely low income households, but just 31 affordable homes for every 100 of those households. That means we are well short of the housing we need, more than 100,000, almost 115,000 homes in the gap there. And these households are particularly vulnerable because they're already putting so much of the income that they have towards their housing needs. Nearly 90% of these households are paying at least a third or over 30% of their income on rent, so meaning they have a housing cost burden. And really nearly 3/4 are paying more than half of their income to meet their housing needs. And I mentioned before that California has seen wage growth, has seen better economic performance than a number of regions across the country. But when you start to unpack that, a lot of those gains were at the top end of the income distribution, and households lower down the scale, more moderate, and especially these extremely low income households, really seen wages stagnate, even as price pressures and rental costs have increasingly grown. And that's really the underpinnings of the homelessness crisis that we've seen across the state and continue to see grow across the state. The next slide shows a map of just recent trends in the homelessness counts across the state. And you can see almost every county has experienced an increase in homelessness between 2017 and 2019. If you look at the Bay Area, San Francisco saw a 17% increase over this time period, but its nearby Alameda and Contra Costa counties saw increases of over 40% in just a 2-year period. In LA, which already has a very sizable homelessness population, those numbers continued to tick upward in this time period by about 7%. And neighboring counties like Orange County, San Bernardino County, again, in that 40% magnitude of increase in just 2 years. So the next slide, we can talk a bit more about what we know about the homelessness crisis. And I do want to underscore this sort of economic underpinnings. I think we often hear about the mental health issues and the addiction issues in this population, but really when you see the magnitude and the scale of the need, it really underscores how much this is an economically driven crisis, that you see this lack of affordable housing supply leading to high prices that people with stagnating wage are increasingly unable to bridge the gap. We know that these challenges disproportionately affect people of color. When you think about the disparities across the housing system, from home ownership, who's able to access home ownership, to where affordable housing is located, and patterns of economic and racial segregation, compounded by disparities in earnings, economic and education outcomes, we see the disproportionate impact this is having on people of color. It's also, homelessness is a crisis that's increasingly affecting seniors and older population. There's been recent research by the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative to look into this that would suggest it's not just that people who were previously homeless or have been experiencing homeless over time are getting older. That's part of the challenge, but we're also seeing an increasing number of people over 55 experiencing homelessness for the first time. So that matters as we think about the service needs of this population too, because the older population tends to have more health challenges and are compounded by other underlying health issues, which in this time period is especially critical and important. If we go to the next slide, we can think about the impact that the COVID-19 crisis is having, first in terms of just the health risks and health impacts across the homeless population. The homeless population, the unhoused, are more likely to be exposed than other populations. They're also more likely to have severe outcomes and sort of worse effect outcomes because of these other compounding and underlying health challenges. We also know that the frontline workers and providers working with this population are at higher risk of exposure, as are a lot of the frontline essential workers and who are staffing grocery stores and delivery services, who are often also living in low-income households that could be facing overcrowding or other situations that would make exposure to this virus spread and explain some of the disproportionate impacts we've been seeing on households of color. We also know that there are a number of households that may not have been vulnerable or housing insecure before COVID-19 who may be facing vulnerabilities now because of the economic fallout, the impacts of efforts to try to flatten the curve, stay-at-home orders, sheltering in place, jobs that in the immediate near term are not able to transition to work at home. So in California, some early estimates that we've been looking at the Turner Center suggest that 40% of renter households have at least one worker in an industry that's likely to be immediately impacted. So over this past month, may have already faced job or income losses because of the economic impacts of the responses to COVID-19. Some of these, a good portion, are the newly vulnerable, about 1.2 million, who weren't cost burdened before, but may be facing cost burdens now that they are seeing reduced incomes or job losses. There's also a significant chunk of these households that were already rent burdened. And so these households are particularly vulnerable as this crisis continues to unfold, as stay-at-home orders tick on longer and longer, of becoming housing insecure. Even knowing that there are moratorium on evictions, the rent clock is still ticking. So these households are going to be facing some real vulnerabilities, especially as payments are expected to start flowing again. And just to offer a few final parting thoughts or helping to frame the rest of this conversation, I think that's one of the things I know at the Turner Center that we're continuing to dig into and are interested in, is understanding as this shelter in place and COVID pandemic continues, we're going to see even more households affected, even more impacts as this sort of ripples through the economy, start to be felt, more households in need. We know there are some aid already in place through the Federal CARES Act and other initiatives, but there are inevitably going to be gaps, households left behind, people who aren't getting, especially in these high cost areas, enough support to make sure that they're stably housed. So what does this mean for the types of aid needed and who is going to be most impacted? And as we think about that, and I think where this conversation is really going to dig in today is trying to see how do we balance sort of near-term need with these longer-term systemic challenges that had led to the crisis we were already facing before COVID-19 hit. And as we think about that, I know we're in sort of unprecedented territory here, but there are lessons from the response to the Great Recession that could inform some of our immediate responses now. But can we think about that for more long-term positioning, especially as we look for opportunities to try and deploy these supports in ways that will really leverage the limited resources we have in coordinated, regionally scaled ways that can help more people in more places. And with that, I look forward to the rest of the discussion and hearing more from Andrea and Jasmine about what's already underway.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very informative, and I appreciate a lot of that. I'm looking forward to returning to the conversation a little later about lessons that could be learned from the previous Great Recession. I think that's very valuable. And we're just going to take a quick little focus on current policy efforts as well as needs. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andrea.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you. Thanks so much to Philanthropy California for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. My name is Andrea Lulian. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, and I oversee the Foundation's initiative to end chronic homelessness in LA County. So I want to be really clear about that. The population and the focus is important to, I think, the questions generally that I'll talk about today that we're discussing as a field are important to all of us, but we are really approaching it from this lens of trying to end homelessness among individuals with the highest acuity, the most complex physical and behavioral health needs. And so this time is a very critical one for so many of the individuals that the foundation has been focusing on for a very long time. We are a private family foundation, and so you'll hear from Jasmine later. They do work that's a little different than us. They've got some different legal restrictions. So I'm also going to speak a little bit to the way the foundation supports its policy work. Even with these sorts of restrictions on the way we inform and fund policy and education. Our board happens to be fairly supportive and has been for a very long time of policy and advocacy work, understanding the importance of it toward achieving long-term goals. So we are a little bit, we really have been in the space for quite a long time, but do intend on becoming even more so in the future because the opportunity and the policy window around housing and homelessness was pretty wide open even before this, and now there is even more discussion and opportunity. So we can do the next slide. On the next slide, I just want to take a little bit of time. It feels a little too soon to really be sharing with everyone exactly what our plan is. Don't really have a plan quite yet. We don't really have a plan quite yet. So we're just sort of asking questions and really observing what it is that we're seeing. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about what it is that the Hilton Foundation team and our community is seeing here in Los Angeles County. We are very happy to be able to say that a lot of the existing infrastructure that we built here in LA County around ending chronic homelessness has been incredibly powerful in moving to action here. For example, our local United Way of Greater Los Angeles has an initiative called Home for Good. It's been in existence for 10 years, and it's a coordinating platform for the nonprofit, business community, philanthropic sector, and the public sector. And so we've been working really well together. We have continued to use that infrastructure in a coordinating way. A big thank you to our partners at United Way for taking on, they quickly reorganized their staff in a FEMA structure and took on new roles and responsibilities and have really helped to coordinate here in Los Angeles. And you can see from a philanthropic perspective, it feels like another very big win for an entity that we've invested over 10 years of funding in building the infrastructure of. And so it's nice to have those examples. Another good example of an existing infrastructure that we are building on here in Los Angeles is the partnership between the nonprofit Brilliant Corners and our Department of Health Services. They work arm in arm in the implementation of a local housing subsidy program. And because they work so closely, funding from many foundations was able to go to Brilliant Corners and help the Department of Health Services here in LA County begin to build out an infrastructure way before a lot of the public bureaucracy challenges that come with funding were sort of ironed out. And so as we know in this situation, even days can make a big difference in saving lives. And so it's another good example of how what we're seeing is this building on this existing infrastructure. The other thing we're seeing is that there are lots of major lessons to be learned from this response. Coordination is more important than ever. We've seen increased coordination between different public entities, between the city of LA and the county of LA for many years, but we're seeing more coordination than we ever have before, which is exciting. We're also seeing, and I'm sure we're not the only community seeing, all the blemishes. They are right there in our face. We can see lots of things we believed were working better that really aren't, or other efforts that we had hoped were heading in the right direction, and now we can really see where some of those challenges are. So I don't know if it's something thing that you all are doing in your communities, but we are working with our nonprofit intermediary partners to actually keep very close track of what is and isn't working. And beginning to have conversations as a community about where are the places we want to put some emphasis and focus. The sooner we sort of step out of this immediate moment and into what's next. On the next slide is just a good example of what it can look like when your nonprofit intermediary partners do have the bandwidth, capacity, and relationships to help build out a plan. This is a 4-stage plan that was developed by our partners at the United Way here in Los Angeles, with some input and design from partners in other sectors. It's a really, you can get this document from our friends at United Way, or I'm happy to send it along, but really what I wanted to demonstrate here is that it is really nice to see again this infrastructure that we built toward ending chronic homelessness generally, be able to step in and help take the time to create the plans and other things that a lot of our first responders or public agencies who are under the weight of a lot of pressure aren't able to do at this moment. With that, I'll pass it along to Jasmine. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was very informative. And then, as you mentioned, we're going to hear a little bit from Jasmine about what her and her team are seeing in terms of the current landscape and needs.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay, great. So good afternoon already. I'm Jasmine Segura, and I'm a program officer with Common Council Foundation. We're based out of Oakland and have a 30+ year history in supporting grassroots organizing and movement building work, which for us really is ensuring that we're centering communities that are most impacted by systemic inequity. So we've been doing this work for over 30 years, and over the past 3 years, we've been leading the Fund for Inclusive California, which is a statewide collaborative fund of 12 funders, and these are pretty diverse funders, local, regional, state, and national funders that are coming together to really invest in policy solutions that are really driven and informed by the experiences of people who are on the front lines and experiencing this work. So that's a little bit of background about what we're doing. In the next slide, I talked a little bit more about the perspective on this conversation that I bring to the table. We really are guided by the values that all policy solutions, as Elizabeth and Andrea were talking about, like policy solutions really need to be centered and driven by the leadership and expertise of impacted communities. We really believe that data and research sort of amplifies that, but that really we look at the experiences of communities that will then drive like the solutions for addressing housing inequality and really moving forward around a more equitable development. We're really, through the fund, are trying to align our practices. So pre-COVID, we were already prioritizing providing core operating support grants, multi-year grants, looking at organizations that are led by impacted communities, and had a really strong racial and economic analysis in terms of the partnerships we were developing across the state. We also were really working around investing in relationships with our community partners and really seeing them as partners in this work, and really challenging kind of the traditional ways in which philanthropy functions. So we were, our grantees were really our advisors to the fund. So the grant making priorities, the grant making strategies of the fund were pretty much driven in a co-creative process with funders at the table. That kind of leads me to the last point, that we really have been already building an infrastructure that really has allowed us to learn and adapt our practices along the way, and to be co-creative in nature with our community partners, which is something that has been extremely helpful in responding to COVID-19. So in the next slide, I just want to give a little bit of synopsis about what we're hearing from communities today. And again, I want to reiterate that like our focus really has been in working with grassroots sort of community-based organizations that are working in doing organizing, kind of become, being politically involved and engaging communities in the civic engagement process. So I'll speak to some of the needs, and the needs are both organizational and impact. And one of the things that we've been hearing over and over in all of our conversations with our community partners is they are all stretched very, very thin, that they're having to now pick up not only doing the organizing and like civic engagement and advancing like policy solutions, but they are also having now to address and respond to safety net needs, particularly organizations that are working with some of the most vulnerable impacted communities like the reentry population, working with undocumented communities, working with mixed status families, seniors, and they're kind of like discussing the added challenges of what it means to be serving those communities, especially in places like the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, where like there are working with a lot of rural communities that don't have access to public transportation, or transportation is very limited. So really just figuring out the different ways that they can provide additional safety net services in places outside of the urban core like LA and the Bay Area. And then in addition to that, given kind of the shelter in place orders, organizations really having to figure out immediately how to transition their operations into a virtual kind of working environment. So many of them that have unfortunately not been kind of receiving a lot of funding from philanthropy are having to find ways to bring in new tools, equipment, software, and training in order for them to be able to continue to organize and engage community in the work that they've been doing and responding to. One of the things that also has been very clear is this really plea to philanthropy to continue to remain nimble and flexible to respond to the emerging needs. As Andrea was mentioning, as philanthropy, and just no one really had envisioned this pandemic. And so it really is forcing everyone to be planning and re-strategize and pivoting on a daily basis or weekly basis. So that's true also for community partners on the front lines that are organizing around this. So as they're kind of thinking about funding, like they're really just asking us to continue to be flexible and nimble and to recognize that the needs that they're seeing on the ground will continue to evolve with time. And so as folks are focusing right now in like rapid response advocacy around moratoriums, that the needs will kind of become more clear and will continue to evolve on a daily, weekly basis. And then the other thing that I also wanted to sort of reiterate that Andrea mentioned is that coalitions, networks, alliances, and existing relationships have really facilitated the organizations to come together in a very sort of immediate way to demand immediate sort of like protections for tenants and for communities that are unhoused. So in places like LA, where there's a coalition that of over 250 organizations and small businesses that's been working with both the City Council and County Board of Supervisors to move forward on renter protections, on moratoriums, on evictions. Folks in the Bay Area also kind of moving forward and demanding that unhoused communities get placed into hotels and are not, they're like kind of a moratorium on sweep encampments, et cetera. So there really has been a strong mobilization, not only in the urban core, but what's been most exciting, if there's a silver lining on all of this, is that in places where tenant protections used to not be feasible, like it wasn't politically viable to move forward on tenant protections in places like Fresno, Tulare, Merced, or San Bernardino, Riverside, that there's been a really exciting momentum there to move forward and recognize that the most sort of low-income communities and communities of color that are at most risk during this pandemic, that we kind of step up to the challenge, both philanthropy and local government to move forward on some of these protections. So we've seen the city of Riverside, Coachella, and others in the Central Valley that are really kind of now stepping up and really looking at the different ways that both philanthropy and local government can ensure some immediate rental protection. So I'll stop there for now, and I know we're going to have a conversation a little bit more about some policy implications and opportunities in the long run, but just that wanted to provide some context for what we've been hearing from our partners and the communities that are at most risk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jasmine. I appreciate that context. And just to get a brief discussion, I'd like to take some time both to hear from our speakers and questions they might have, as well as questions from the crowd. I want to first start with a question that was posed, and it was that recent data around homelessness prevention indicated that many programs were not targeting people who would have become homeless without homeless prevention assistance. And that prevention dollars should be targeted to those most likely to fall into homelessness without prevention assistance. I was curious how how you see COVID-19 changing homelessness prevention.
Elizabeth, do you want to take that first, or do you want me to?
You go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I mean, if you really dig into the evaluations that suggest that help to demonstrate that homeless service prevention dollars are not always well targeted, one of the major outcomes of that, one of the major findings in that is that we don't have adequate data to help us better identify people who are at the highest risk. And a lot of times it is because of a lack of data integration. So I'd be happy to speak to whomever asked the question in significant detail about what's happening here in the County of LA offline, but in short order, historically here in the County of Los Angeles, you might have a history of juvenile justice, be part of the foster care system, and hit the homeless service system. And one of the only ways your homeless service provider knows that you had that history is because you self-reported, because those databases don't necessarily speak to one another. And because of that, it has reduced our ability to be able to use predictive analytics or other sorts of mechanisms to help identify people at the highest risk and really be able to target prevention dollars. And so this is something I think a lot of communities have been working on. Last year, there was actually a huge win in the state legislature that allowed county entities to share data as they never have before. So the policy window was open on that before this response even happened, before COVID even happened. And so if you think that this further pushes the policy window, I would encourage you to take advantage of it. I think the next 3 to 4 years, we're going to see a lot of research and information that will come forward that's going to help us do a much better job at targeting people for prevention interventions. But yes, you're right. Historically, it just has not been as good. And part of the reason is because there are major data challenges in identifying who would be at highest risk for, and who would be have the highest need for those interventions.
Thank you, Andrea. And Elizabeth, wasn't sure, was there something you'd like to share in response to that question?
Just to underscore the challenges with the lack of good data, throughout the housing continuum, from the need for affordable housing to the risk of homelessness. Part of that is just what's readily available in a timely fashion. And I think that fragmentation is a challenge across the system. And that's from a programmatic perspective, but also a jurisdictional perspective, because people, it's hard to find the systems that can integrate in a privacy protected, responsible way, but also with the systems that can talk to each other. And I think that is the future of figuring out a more integrated response, is being able to cross those silos and jurisdictional boundaries in a more fluid way that can in real time follow people a little more closely.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And also I wanted to open up to the speakers if you had any questions based on the content you were hearing. Wonderful opportunity to hear from you as well.
So Elizabeth, I'm really curious. You mentioned in your remarks this idea of near-term needs and long-term positioning and things we learned from the recession. And I'd be curious to hear more, even if it's more just like the kinds of questions you think the research and academic community is asking. I think it's fairly similar in a different vein, but similar to this conversation that people are having about the fact that homelessness has always been an emergency. And for the first time ever, we're really treating it like the emergency that it is. But that also means that we're finally channeling lessons from actual like other emergency response mechanisms and trying to utilize them here. And so there seems to be a couple of different things that overlap. And I'm curious if you've got any thoughts about that or research questions you think philanthropy should be investing in.
Yeah, there are two things I would say to this. One, just to follow on my last point about the fragmentation and the challenges that raises, which I think syncs up with both what you and Jasmine were noting about capacity gaps, is you know, in the wake of the last recession, even with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, there were a lot of communities that had trouble accessing and really deploying those funds because of a lack of capacity. You can think of like smaller suburban jurisdictions or more rural communities that don't have the same institutional capacity that big cities have. And you know, following that crisis, there were sort of ad hoc a number of collaboratives that started forming, you know, jurisdictions, maybe not so totally regional in scope, but sub-regional and building up to the regional level to try and share capacity, attract funds that could be used across those jurisdictions, which also helps avoid having multiple jurisdictions competing for the same pot of funds when really they're neighbors who could use those in an effective way together. But some of those systems, I think the question is how many of those were really sustainable, or were they just they were just stood up for that crisis and then dismantled over time. And I think that is one of the questions we're wondering about now is are there any lessons for any of those responses that may have been more durable, or can we think about building more durable vehicles right now that can address the near-term need, but stand up over the long term to address these really underlying systemic gaps that have been in place even before the crisis. And you mentioned like the emergency response to homelessness, and I know we're going to get there, but if people are housed now, what happens in 90 days, right? Or if you look upstream to people who are not yet homeless, is the right vehicle really an emergency voucher, or is it figuring out how to work through a voucher system that already exists that could make real capacity gains even after the crisis? So I think those are some of the things that we're trying to tease out in the policy response space.
I think that's a wonderful segue, Elizabeth, as we look to have a little bit more of a conversation about future-focused opportunities. And I'd love to pass it over to Andrea to hear more about what the Conrad and Hilton Foundation is asking themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elizabeth, I just want to say one of the big questions we've been asking ourselves on the policy side is something you brought up in that. I thank you so much for that response, but this idea of economies of scale. We see a lot of policy get divided up by city jurisdiction, and a lot of times implementing a policy on a city scale that maybe butts up against another city is not as efficient. And so it's definitely something that's been on our mind as a general policy question, and I would love to continue talking to you about what that looks like in this response situation. So all right, so here, as many of us know, when you work in philanthropy, your job is not to know all the answers, it's to go out and find them and support some solutions to happen. So what we've got here are some of the questions that the Hilton Foundation team that works on our homelessness strategy is asking itself. I'll just go through these one at a time and provide some really quick examples of sort of what we're talking about. So in regards to what do we want to stick? We heard actually today in both of the plenary sessions about telehealth. Telehealth is a good example of this. We're seeing more and more telehealth happening here in LA County to provide services. It's great to see public entities that historically would not reimburse for telehealth at a similar rate or at all finally reimbursing. And we are seeing what one funder on a call I was on, a healthcare funder, I loved this, said we're seeing 3 years of innovation happen in 3 weeks on this side. So the question becomes, what do we want to stick? And in the same vein, also I feel like philanthropy has a key role to play in cautioning what are the risks. Let's not get too overexcited. What are some of the parameters that need to be put on this? I think about it particularly in terms of this highly vulnerable population. If we move too heavily to telehealth, will those people with really complex needs who are initially moving into housing get the in-person sort of care and connection that they need if telehealth becomes too easy and too accessible. And so I think there's a pro and con side to this, but really taking advantage of that and watching closely to what may happen with some of these innovations. Another really great innovation that we're starting to see movement on is for those of you who've ever worked as a frontline worker and tried to get someone into housing, you know that oftentimes housing authorities might require someone to come in once or twice in order to complete their voucher process. Now we're seeing DocuSign with our housing authorities, and it took a pandemic to get there, but that's very exciting. And how can we sort of encourage making something like that stick? What happens on day 91? Elizabeth sort of alluded to this idea that we've got all these individuals that we've worked very hard, particularly these very high acuity individuals, to move into some interim housing for isolation purposes to keep them safe. And we've been asking ourselves as a foundation, as well as part of our community, as well as partners at the state level, what happens on day 91? How do we ensure that those individuals are moved into housing? We heard a little bit this morning from Dr. Ghali, this concept that a lot of these individuals are being prioritized because they have very complex physical health needs. They also are generally 55 or 65 and older, and so they have very high vulnerabilities, and this is very likely not the only wave of this pandemic that we're going to see in our country. And so how do we make sure these individuals are in housing so that when the next wave comes, we don't have to do this interim stage for them again? How do we make sure they're not released onto the street? We're asking ourselves about policies, state policies, local policies, federal policies that are being expedited or delayed. We've been here, you know, CalAIM is a good example. It's the California healthcare policy is being delayed 1 year. There are potential pros. There were some things that maybe weren't as beneficial for individuals experiencing homelessness as the 1115 waiver was, or health homes was, like whole person care or health homes was. So is there a benefit for our advocates to have more time to advocate on that front? On the con side, not really exactly sure what happens in this year where there's no health homes funding or whole person care funding to cover their needs. So we're sort of examining that. Our partners are examining that, and we are trying as the Hilton Foundation to provide education and support in ways that we are able to from our own experiences. Another good example is the state Flex Fund, which is based on the LA County Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool in some ways. So we're trying to help educate and share how that could be valuable if it were to be expedited or were to be delayed, either way, how we can sort of help share lessons learned here from LA County. The last bullet on here is about impacting those with different acuity levels. Actually, really interestingly, Elizabeth also brought up the idea of the types of housing that have been built across California, and that it's been generally single family homes, higher incomes. And so the big question here is we feel like there's an important role to play for our partners as well as the foundation in different ways to make sure that the needs of those with complex physical and behavioral health needs are being met in any new or other policy efforts that are emerging, and that they're not getting lumped in with other policies, that there is a clear delineation between what their specific needs are versus other populations. On the next slide, I've got 3 more I'll quickly run through. How to leverage efforts and funding around COVID-19 for long-term impact. We also heard this morning from Dr. Ghali about how Project Roomkey would like to use some of its funding or its evolution to purchase buildings. That would be awesome. Would love to, you know, continue the conversation about how the role philanthropy can play in that. There are questions about the housing and real estate market. I've been in many conversations with other funders who have said to me, man, I wish we did things different in 2010 when the real estate market was a little down. It's very true. We didn't necessarily take advantage potentially the way we could have to acquire more real estate that could be used for supportive or other kinds of housing that's affordable for our lower income communities. And lastly, how do we go beyond just discussing the issues of race, equity, and justice? To us, this is something we have continually been talking about as a team at the foundation. We are, as everyone is, just appalled by the news articles and the reports that are coming out, but what are we doing about it? And so if we go to the next slide, actually, this was a really great resource that the foundation, that was shared with the foundation through our partners and funders together to end homelessness. There's a, yeah.
Just a second. If it's all right, I'm going to let folks know that we're going to share this with them. And I just want to provide a little bit of time for Jasmine's section so that we can move forward. Thank you so much. I graciously appreciate that. And just to let folks know, these PowerPoint slides will be shared with everyone. So these resources will be available to you. And I just want to provide, and as well as the California Roadmap Home 2030. And I just want to provide just some time also for Jasmine to share a few of her future focused opportunities that she's developing with her team.
Thank you, Carlos. And remind me the time. I can go through these really fast for discussion.
If you'd be so kind, thank you.
Okay.
Folks for the next 12:45.
Yeah, no, thank you. There's just one thing that I wanted to kind of reiterate. I know we shared it sort of in passing, but like really highlighting that a lot of the challenges that we're seeing now, the realities that we're seeing really are not a result of COVID, but really a result of like decades and generations of just inequities and disparities in a lot of the systems. So when we look at the digital divide, like folks having access to laptops for education equity, like folks who are coming out of re-entry populations, undocumented immigrants, et cetera, that like these are just the inequities have really been exacerbated by this pandemic. So with that in mind, I think we've been in conversation with a lot of our community partners, have asked very similar questions that Andrea was talking about earlier. And one of the things that we've been sharing or that we've been hearing over and over is really a call to action for philanthropy to continue to prioritize general support grants that really encompass the flexibility and nimbleness that is needed at this moment to be able to respond to those emerging needs. In addition to like additional emergency response grants that really can help a lot of our community partners pick up and have some capacity with all of the demands that are on their plates at this moment. Accelerating payment schedules for folks who already have like multi-year grants, like the need right now to actually build up the capacity to be able to respond to the scale and need at the moment. And then just being a lot more flexible with deliverables, timelines, and really eliminating reporting requirements. One of the things we did is we're replacing applications and reporting requirements with a call and an interview with our community partners. And that really has been so much more fruitful because we've been able to engage in a back and forth conversation and really learn what the real challenges and opportunities are at this moment. The other thing that we've been really hearing loud and clear is that philanthropy also has a critical voice. And I'll be curious to hear from Andrea, like as a family foundation, a private foundation, like how they're also engaging in policy and in partnership with the public sector to be able to amplify really the echo of what the community groups are already talking and demanding at this moment. So the voice that philanthropy has is very strong, and it's a different kind of political voice that we can also exercise in this moment, and by taking the lead of our community partners. So really the call to action to continue to advocate for those policy solutions that are driven and informed by community. And then also kind of not forgetting about the long term. And what is it going to take to move forward policies that are going to ensure equitable post-recovery plans? So unless we have the accurate data, disaggregated data on like most vulnerable populations, like we're not going to be able to actually have an equitable recovery plan that's going to center those that are most impacted. And we will repeat the mistakes, unfortunately, that we did in 2008. So really just looking at the need for those long terms. And then the next slide, just want to emphasize some of the like policy opportunities. And before I get into the policy, one of the most exciting things that we've been seeing right now is that given kind of the crisis and that there's been such a strong connection now between the housing justice groups, the tenants' rights groups, with like folks who are working on issues of homelessness, and also with landlords and homeowners. So I think that we've been talking about this sort of like spectrum of like housing, and we've been operating kind of in silos, but really in this moment, there's been such a strong opportunity to kind of come together and figuring out like how to actually prioritize and keep communities in homes and safe, not only in this moment, but also in the long term. These are just some of the list of policies that groups are moving forward around. I talked about immediate sort of moratoriums on rent increases, on evictions and foreclosures. Again, kind of the partnership with homeless advocates, really talking about moratorium on encampment sweeps, and then expanding immediate housing options for unhoused communities, and then really looking at what that like permanent pathway looks like as well, for public and philanthropy, really to make additional resources available for emergency rental and mortgage assistance forgiveness plans and programs, investing in data and research to really understand the long-term impacts of COVID, again, with the particular focus on those that are most impacted, low-income communities, that are facing kind of compound challenges. And then lastly, policies that really secure an equitable recovery plan. And folks are sort of including the intersectional approach, looking at minimum wage policies, looking at universal health care for all workers, and like really challenging the ways in which the systems have failed these communities, and really trying to envision a recovery plan that again centers communities, and that there's a lot of opportunity right now to move forward with more bold policy solutions that are going to be in the long run equitable and more beneficial to all communities in a way that that is really responding to the needs of California. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions around that.
I want to thank you. That was very informative, Jasmine. And we are actually wrapping up, and there are a few just points that I want to note first before we do. First of all, thank you to our incredibly knowledgeable speakers for joining us today and helping us learn a little bit more about the landscape and opportunities we have to come together to make actionable changes so that more neighbors have safe and dignified housing. There were two very important questions that unfortunately we weren't able to get to, but I just want to acknowledge them because they brought up some really important points. First was, how can philanthropy partner with government so that we have the scale of funding needed to stabilize organizations and address disparities in homelessness? And although we have not housed everyone, how do we bring forward lessons from the current response that has found us housing thousands more individuals and families, that we can go forward with the truth that homelessness need not exist? And so I think those are very helpful to kind of keep in the frame of mind as we all move forward and trying to find ways in which we can invest our time and energy to look for a solution. I just want to say that after these breakout sessions for the rest of the summit, we will be back on schedule. So afternoon breakouts will start at 11:45 momentarily, and you should expect to receive an email with links for afternoon breakouts. And please remember to check your clutter or spam inbox. So with that said, thank you for joining us today. I want to clarify, did I say 12:45? Yes, 12:45, the afternoon breakouts will be starting. So get ready to hurry on over to those. And if you have any questions, please email info@philanthropyca.org. Thank you all.